My name is David Carter. I'm 29 years old. I'm the manager of an electronics store in a small town in the interior of Texas. My life has always been common. Work from 9 to 5, dinner at 7, movies on weekends. Nothing extraordinary. I was never someone who believed in the supernatural or conspiracy theories. I always thought these things were exaggerations of too many creative minds. But all that has changed. It all started with something that seemed absolutely harmless, a quick stop at a Walmart in the middle of nowhere. I just wanted to buy some batteries and maybe a bottle of water. However, little did I know that this simple visit would turn my life into a nightmare from which I have not yet been able to escape. Before we start, turn off the lights, grab your headphones, and click subscribe to support the channel. That way, you don't miss any of our stories. It was a Friday night, shortly after 11 o'clock. I was coming back from a work trip that hadn't exactly been a success. Exhausted, with the tank almost empty and hungry pressing, I spotted the Walmart lights on the horizon. It looked like an oasis in the middle of the desert. The store was in a strange place, isolated from any other commerce or habitation. There wasn't even a gas station nearby, just that giant building, surrounded by a huge empty parking lot, lit by streetlights whose lamps flickered occasionally. I parked the car near the main entrance. The silence was so deep that, when I turned off the engine, my own footsteps on the asphalt sounded like shots in the dark. Deep down, something seemed wrong. Maybe it was the fact that there were no cars left in the parking lot except mine. It must be just the time, I thought. After all, who shops at Walmart close to midnight? I entered the store. Those automatic doors opened with a high-pitched sound, as if protesting my presence. Inside, the hallways stretched for an infinite distance, covered in a cool white light that seemed even more intense than usual. Deep down, I could barely make out anyone's presence. An employee was stacking boxes, but his movements seemed mechanic, as if it were programmed. Still, I moved on. I grabbed a cart that creaked annoyingly and started walking through the aisles. What I didn't know yet is that, when I crossed those doors, I had entered something much bigger than an ordinary supermarket. As I pushed the cart down the food aisle, I noticed something strange. There was a complete absence of sounds. No announcements over the speakers, no sound from other customers, not even the characteristic hum of refrigerators. It was as if the entire store was trapped in an oppressive silence. I stopped in front of a shelf to pick up a packet of cookies. As soon as I touched my hand to the plastic, I felt a slight shiver go up my arm. It was a strange feeling, as if something was watching me. I looked around, but I didn't see anyone. I kept walking, trying to ignore the strangeness, until I reached the electronics corridor. There, the discomfort became more evident. TV screens displayed static images, with interference that came and went at an almost hypnotic pace. And the most disturbing thing, on one of the screens, for a moment I saw something that looked the reflection of my face, but with a smile that I definitely wasn't doing. I took a step back, confused. It's just fatigue, I thought, trying to convince myself. But with each step I took, more bizarre details began to jump out at me. Some shelves were empty, but the products that remained had old packaging, with designs I hadn't seen since my childhood. I picked up a can of soda and read the expiration date, 1998. My heart started racing. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. It didn't make sense. He did nothing. And it was at that moment that I first heard the sound that made me freeze in place. Steps. They weren't mine, and they came from somewhere behind me, slow and heavy. The footsteps continued, resounding through the empty halls. But when I looked back, I saw no one. I felt a lump tighten in my throat. The cart began to creak louder as I hurriedly pushed it, trying to shake off that feeling of being followed. It was then that I saw something that was supposed to calm me down, but did the exact opposite. A customer. She was a woman, or at least she seemed to be. She had her back to me, standing in front of a shelf in the cleaning products aisle. She wore a grimy gray coat and held a bottle of fabric softener in one hand. But what really made me uncomfortable was the way she was completely still, as if she were a statue. "Excuse me," I said, my voice echoing unsettlingly in the silence. She did not answer. Is everything okay? I asked again, taking a step towards her. At that moment, she moved, not slowly, like someone distracted, but with a sudden and mechanical movement, turning his face towards me in an unnatural way, as if he had no muscles in his neck. Your eyes, they were fixed on me, but there was no life in them. It was like looking at a wax mask. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She just stood there, staring at me with that blank stare that seemed to cross my soul. I felt my feet recede on their own. As I turned to leave that hallway, I saw another figure in the distance, a man this time, standing between the shelves of cereal. He was looking at me too, with the same lifeless gaze, as if he was expecting something. Panic began to set in. There were only two people, but it seemed that their eyes weighed more than the emptiness of the entire store. Is this normal? Maybe they're just, I thought, but deep down I knew something was very, very wrong. It was then that a noise cut the air, the dry sound of a cash register scanner, even though there was no one at the cashier. It sounded repeatedly, too fast, like an out-of-control machine. My mind screamed to get out of there, but something held me. A morbid curiosity, perhaps. The sound came from the cashier's area, an incessant beep, interspersed with a mechanical noise of a roll of paper unwinding. It felt like someone was scanning hundreds of items in a matter of seconds, without pause. I followed the sound, even though every fiber of my body screamed at me to go in the opposite direction. When I finally turned down the hall and arrived at the scene before me was as absurd as it was terrifying. The cash register was working on its own. The shopping conveyor belt moved, but there was no product on it. The red scanner flashed frantically, passing through an invisible void, and the receipts seemed endless, piling up on the floor in a grotesque pile of paper. I looked around looking for someone, but the area was deserted. Even so, the machine continued as if it were being operated by invisible hands. My first instinct was to run away, but then I noticed something strange on the receipt that was piling up on the floor. It wasn't a list of common items, like fruit or electronics. The names of the products were different. Lost Memories, $12.99. Buried Secrets, $7.49. Fear of the Unknown, $19.99. Each item seemed more abstract and unsettling than the last. I picked up the paper with trembling hands, trying to understand what was happening. When I turned the receipt over, I saw something that made me freeze. My name. It was there written in big, clear letters. David Carter, purchase completed. The beep stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was so heavy that it seemed to be crushing me. It was at that moment that I felt something behind me. It was slow, muffled breathing, as if someone was standing inches from me. I held my breath and turned around abruptly, but there was no one there. Nothing made sense. I had to get out of there. Needed. But when I looked at the exit door, something seemed different, as though she was no longer there. I was close to losing control. My heart beat so hard that it seemed to echo through the silent corridors. The exit door had disappeared, or at least it seemed to be no longer where it should be. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down, when I heard a distant, almost whispered sound coming from somewhere nearby. "Can I help?" The voice was hoarse, loaded with a tone that sounded uncomfortably artificial. I turned in the direction of the sound and saw an employee. He was standing at the end of the aisle, wearing the blue Walmart uniform, with a badge that read Allan. "Yes, I can't find the way out," I replied, trying to sound rational despite my nervousness. Allan stepped forward, and the white light of the hallways highlighted his face. He was pale, as if he had never seen the sun, and his eyes were deeply dark. Something about him was terribly wrong. He didn't blink, not once. "You shouldn't be here so late," he said, not moving his lips much further than necessary. I tried to explain myself. I just needed a few things. But I think that... He raised his hand, abruptly interrupting me. "Everything is in order," he said, in a monotonous tone that only increased my uneasiness. "Can you show me the way out?" I asked, hoping that he could at least help me. Allan did not respond immediately. He just stood there, staring at me. For a moment, I thought he was analyzing every inch of my face, as if he was trying to decipher who I was or what I was doing there. Then, finally, he pointed to a hallway to the left. "Over there," he said, without taking his eyes off me. I hesitated, but something in his posture, or perhaps in his eyes that seemed to have no soul, convinced me that continuing to talk was not a good idea. I started walking in the direction he had indicated, but when I looked back to thank him, he was no longer there. The corridor he pointed me out seemed endless, lit only by dimly flickering lamps. But it wasn't the corridor itself that bothered me. It was the fact that with every step I took, I felt as if someone was walking right behind me. The corridor seemed tighter with each step. The shelves, high and full of misaligned products, seemed to curve, creating an oppressive feeling. I kept moving forward, trying to ignore the sound of footsteps that insisted on echoing behind me, as if someone was following my walk, but always out of sight. It was then that something in the corner of my eye caught my attention. Standing in the middle of a shelf of cleaning products, between bottles of disinfectant and sponges, was an object that made no sense. It was a picture frame, an old model, with a worn gold frame and rust marks on the corners. What really disturbed me, though, was the photography inside it. It was a photo of me. Not a photo I remembered taking, but it was definitely me. I was in a place that looked like a park, sitting on a bench, looking directly at the camera. My clothes looked something I hadn't worn in years. I picked up the picture frame with trembling hands, unable to look away from the image. The more I watched her, the more bizarre details began to emerge. In the background of the photo, almost hidden among the trees, there was a figure, an indistinct silhouette, but clearly looking at me. I turned the picture frame, hoping to find some explanation. On the back, there was a label with erased letters, as if it had been written a long time ago. I could barely decipher the words, but what I read chilled me to the bone. "You shouldn't be here." I let go of the picture frame instinctively, and it fell to the floor with a hollow sound. But when I looked down, it was gone. In the place where it should have been, there was only a dark spot on the ground, which seemed to be growing slowly, as if it were alive. I took 2 steps back, almost stumbling. The air seemed to get heavier, and I knew I needed to get out of that hallway immediately. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, but something deep in my subconscious whispered that I was wrong. Very wrong. My breathing was quickened, and the air seemed denser by the second. I knew I needed to get out of there. After the missing picture frame and that ominous message, any remnant of curiosity gave way to a primitive instinct to flee. I ran back down the aisle, ignoring the creaking of the card I had left behind. The shelves seemed to stretch, as if the aisle never ended. But finally, I turned right and saw what was supposed to be the main exit, or at least where it should be. The automatic doors were no longer there. Instead, there was only a plain white wall, with no opening, as if the exit had never existed. "It can't be," I whispered, my heart almost coming out of my mouth. I walked to where the door should be and touched the wall. It was solid, cold, like concrete. I looked around, looking for any other way, but all I saw were the reflections of the cold lights flashing in the hallway windows. It was then that I realized something even stranger. The reflection of the aisle in the window did not correspond to what I saw behind me. In my reality, it was empty, but in the glass, I could see figures moving. They walked slowly, as if watching me from a distance, their distorted and inhuman forms. I swallowed, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. But when one of these figures stopped in the reflection, directly behind me, I felt panic take over. I turned sharply. Nothing. But the reflection was still there, unchanging. The figure was standing behind me, on the glass, but in real life, the space was empty. I tried to scream for help, but my voice seemed to disappear into thin air, as if the sound couldn't get through that strange environment. Walmart now seemed like a place out of reality, a maze designed to trap me. Not knowing what to do, I started walking in the opposite direction, looking for another way out. With each step, it seemed that the lights were getting dimmer and the corridors narrower, as if the place itself was trying to swallow me. My hands trembled as I walked, trying to remember the path I had taken. But somehow, The store seemed to change around me. Hallways that once led to the electronics area now led to gardening sections. The signage, which should be my reference, seemed scrambled, with arrows pointing in impossible directions. Every corridor I entered was a trap. When I tried to go back, the path behind me was no longer the same. It was like being trapped in a living puzzle, a maze that moved around to make sure I never got out. The feeling of being watched increased. The oppressive silence was occasionally broken by a distant noise, something falling, or perhaps the sound of hurried footsteps, but never close enough for me to identify. In a moment of desperation, I ran into what seemed to be the main hallway, but when I turned, I almost hit something, or rather someone. It was Allan, the employee I had seen before. He was standing there in the middle of the hallway, his eyes fixed on me. "Lost?" he asked, with that monotone that made every word seem like a threat. I can't find the way out. The place is different," I replied, my voice sounding weaker than I would like. Allan tilted his head, as if confused or, worse, curious. "The corridors never change. You're just not looking right." Before I could answer, he began to walk in the opposite direction, slowly but without hesitation. I followed him, thinking he could take me somewhere safe. But what I saw as I turned into the next corridor made me stop immediately. The space was empty. There were no shelves, products, or even visible floor. Just a black void, like an infinite abyss. Allan kept walking, ignoring the absence of anything around him. "Wait!" I shouted. He paused for a moment, turning to me with that blank stare. "You've been here for a long time, you know? Maybe it's too late." And then he disappeared. A blink of an eye, and he was just gone, as if he had never existed. The ground beneath my feet began to shake slightly, as if something was changing again. Not knowing what else to do, I turned around and started running, but the runners kept taking me back to the same place, the emptiness, the abyss. Now, I was sure of one thing, that Walmart was not a normal place. He was alive. If you've ever had a nightmare where you can't leave a place, you know how I felt. Leave it in the comments. Do you think there is an explanation for this, or is it something completely supernatural? My run through the halls seemed endless. Every time I turned a corner, it was as if I were back at the starting point. The feeling that Walmart was alive, molding itself to my despair, became unbearable. It was then that I heard the first voice. "David?" It was soft, almost a whisper coming from somewhere nearby. My steps faltered, and I looked around, trying to identify where the sound was coming from. There was no one, but the air seemed colder, as if something invisible had just passed me. "David, you need to get out of here." Another voice, different from the first, this time closer, as if it were whispering in my ear. I turned sharply, but again saw nothing but the endless shelves. What scared me the most was that the voices were familiar. The first one looked like that of my mother, who had passed away years ago. The second, it was my own. I started walking faster, my heart pounding in my chest. But the voices did not stop. They kept calling me, louder and louder, more and more desperate. "You should never have come here, David." I stopped in the middle of the hallway, trying to control my breathing. I covered my ears with my hands, but the voices were inside my head, echoing like a memory I couldn't erase. It was then that I noticed something strange on the shelves around me. The products had changed. They were no longer common items such as canned goods or tools. Now the shelves were filled with objects I recognized. A lunchbox I'd used in school, a watch my dad had given me for my 18th birthday, and even a children's book my grandmother read to me when I was a kid. The message was clear. This place knew who I was. The voices became more intense, more aggressive. Now they all spoke at the same time, like a chorus of maddening whispers. "Why don't you listen? Why are you still here?" I started running again, trying to get away from the voices, but they were everywhere, surrounding me, suffocating me. Finally, I saw something at the end of the hallway that made me stop abruptly. It was a large mirror, framed in rusty metal, reflecting the hallway behind me. But what I saw in the reflection was not me. It was something that looked like me, but it had a sickly smile, eyes as dark as the emptiness I had seen before. He was standing there watching me, and then slowly he started walking towards me. My legs stood still, my body frozen with terror. I knew I needed to get out of there, but where? The mirror was there, imposing, reflecting something that was not my reality. My feet seemed stuck to the ground, unable to pull away as that figure, my distorted replica, approached by reflection. His steps were deliberate, each movement charged with a frightening calm. But when I looked back, there was no one in the hallway with me. The reflection was walking towards me, but the real space was empty. Sweat ran down my forehead as my eyes went from the mirror to the empty hallway and back to the glass. The reflection stopped when I was a few steps away, tilting my head, as if he was studying me. "Who? Who are you?" My voice came out shaky, barely audible. The figure in the mirror smiled, but did not respond. His eyes, or rather, my eyes in the reflection, were completely black, an emptiness so deep it seemed to pull everything around. Then he did something that froze my blood. He raised his hand and pointed directly at me. Not for my reflection, for me. It was at this moment that the glass began to crack. Small cracks spread across the surface of the mirror, as if it were about to explode. The sound of the cracks was loud, almost deafening, and I took a few steps back, waiting for it to break. And then, with a final crack, the mirror exploded. But instead of shards of glass, what came out was impossible. On the other side, a liquid darkness began to drip across the floor, as if the mirror were a door to another place. The hallway was being invaded by that black and pulsating substance, which moved as if it had a life of its own. I tried to run, but my feet seemed to sink into the ground. The liquid spread quickly, climbing up the shelves, covering the products, turning off the lights as it went. It was then that I heard the voices again, but this time they came from within the darkness. There were hundreds, thousands of whispers, all talking at the same time, creating a cacophony that made my head throb. "You can't escape, David. You're never going to leave here." The corridor seemed to stretch longer and longer, and the darkness was about to reach me. It was at that moment that I saw, in the distance, a faint light. A way out, or another trap. I had no choice. I managed to move and ran with all my might, ignoring the weight on my legs and the sound of voices. I ran toward the dim light that seemed to be my only hope of escape. Each step felt heavier, as if the ground itself was trying to hold me down. The sound of the voices within the darkness grew louder, more desperate, as if they were begging me to stop. But I couldn't, not after everything I had seen. When I finally reached what seemed to be the end of the hallway, the light abruptly disappeared. In an instant, the entire Walmart was engulfed in total darkness. I was paralyzed. My breath echoed in the void, and the silence was so absolute that I could hear the beating of my own heart. It was as if the whole world had disappeared, leaving only emptiness and me. Then something changed. A faint sound began to emerge from the darkness, like a distant electric hum. Gradually, it turned into a jagged pop, like light bulbs trying to light up. That's when the lights started flashing. With each blink, I saw fragments of my surroundings. But nothing seemed real. The shelves were crooked, as if they had been pulled by some invisible force. The products looked old, covered in a thin layer of dust. And the shadows, they moved, but they didn't belong to anything I could see. In one of the blinks I saw Allan again. He was standing in the distance, watching me, but this time, his eyes had no expression. They were completely black, just like the ones in my replica in the mirror. The lights went out again, and the hum ceased. "David?" The voice came from close, so close that I felt the air move around me. "Who's there?" My voice came out in an almost inaudible tone, choked with fear. The lights flashed again, but this time, there were no more runners. I was in an empty, infinite space, surrounded only by darkness, and the sound of my own name being whispered over and over again. And then everything stopped. The darkness stood still, as if holding his breath. It was at that moment that I felt a hand touch my shoulder. I turned around, but there was no one there. I didn't know what was more terrifying, the icy tap on my shoulder, the voices whispering my name, or the fact that no matter where I looked, there was no way out. I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts. I had to find a way out. I decided to run, even though I couldn't see anything, hoping that speed could keep me away from that nightmare. But at every turn, something seemed wrong. I felt like I was running in circles, like a mouse trapped in an endless maze. The voices grew louder, blending into a chaotic chorus that threatened to drive me crazy. Suddenly, the lights flashed again, but this time something changed. The environment seemed distorted. The shelves were tilted, almost as if they were bent by some invisible force. There were mirrors scattered on the floor, broken, reflecting images that made no sense. I saw Allan again, or at least something that seemed to be him. It was standing in the background, but it didn't move as it used to. His arms were unusually long, and his head hung to the side, like a broken puppet. "You can't escape," he said, but his mouth didn't move. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, reverberating inside my mind. I screamed, a scream of pure despair, the kind of sound you let out when you know you're losing control. And then something happened. The shelves began to crumble, falling like dominoes, and the floor beneath my feet shook. A crack began to form, slowly opening up like an abyss. The liquid darkness that had come out of the mirror before now trickled down the walls, getting closer and closer to me. I tried to pull away, but the crack reached me. The ground beneath my feet gave way, and I began to fall. I fell for a time that seemed eternal, surrounded only by emptiness. The voices began to fade, one by one, until only the sound of my own breathing remained. When I finally hit something solid, I realized I was back at the beginning. It was the Walmart parking lot. My car was there, right where I had left it. The lights of the store were on quiet, as if nothing had happened. For a moment, I thought I had escaped. But when I looked at the car window, I saw something that made me retreat. My reflection was there, but it wasn't me. He looked at me with that same sickly smile I had seen before. I was in the parking lot, but nothing felt right. The store was too quiet, as if time itself had stopped. When I looked at the car window, the shock almost knocked me down. My reflection was there, but it wasn't mine. He stared at me with that distorted smile, his black eyes shining unnaturally. Without thinking twice, I turned my back on the car and ran. My footsteps echoed through the empty parking lot, and the cold of the night seemed more intense. I ran to the edge of the asphalt where there should be a road, but there was nothing, just darkness, a dense fog covering everything beyond Walmart. I took a deep breath, my chest rising and falling rapidly. I looked back at the car, trying to decide what to do, but then I realized something terrifying. The door of Walmart was open again. It wasn't open before, and as if drawn by a force I couldn't resist, I began to walk back toward the entrance. Each step felt harder, as if the air around me was getting heavier. As I passed through the automatic doors, they closed behind me with a loud crack, as if sealing my fate. The interior of the store was different. The lights flickered faintly, and a layer of dust covered everything. It was as if time had advanced decades since the last time I was there. The shelves were full, but not with ordinary products. I grabbed a bag of snacks, and my breath got stuck in my throat. The packaging was an old design that I remembered from childhood, something I hadn't seen in decades. I kept walking, and each item felt more familiar. A t-shirt with the logo of a band I loved as a teenager. A toy that I had lost when I was a child. A bottle of water with the label of a school event I attended when I was 12 years old. And then at the end of a hallway, I saw something that paralyzed me, a diary. He was mine. I recognized the worn leather cape, the scribble marks I used to make when I was 14. I picked up the diary with trembling hands and opened it. The pages were filled, but not with my handwriting. Each line seemed written with mechanical perfection, detailing events in my life, some I barely remembered, others I had never told anyone. But one particular passage made my blood run cold. David is reading these words right now. He feels the weight of it all, but he doesn't understand. He still thinks he can escape, but it belongs to us now. The words began to fade, like ink being sucked across the pages. Then I heard that familiar sound, the beep of the cash register. "No again, no," I mumbled, my feet moving instinctively toward the sound. There was Allan, standing next to the cashier, with a bag full of items that seemed to come straight out of the shelves, full of memories of my life. He looked at me and smiled, a wide, grotesque smile that seemed to rip through his face. "You left something behind," he said, pointing to the diary in my hands. What happened next was pure instinct. I held the diary tightly and ran away from it, crossing the halls as the sound of the scanner echoed behind me. The beep seemed to get closer, faster and faster, as if Allan was following me. I turned corners, passed through unknown corridors, until I found an exit that was not there before. It was a small door, almost hidden between two shelves of children's products. Without thinking, I opened the door and entered. On the other side, I found myself in an even more disturbing place. It was parking again, only this time there was no car at all, nor fog, just Walmart, with its lights flashing in the distance, and a silence that seemed alive. The parking lot was empty. There was no sign of my car or any other vehicle. It was as if I had been left alone in a world where only Walmart existed, with its cold lights and the endless aisles I knew all too well. I looked back at the store and realized that the automatic doors were open again. A faint glow emanated from within, as if calling me. "I'm not coming back," I muttered to myself, but my voice sounded weak, unconvinced. I took a few steps away from the store, toward the vastness of the parking lot. The fog that had once blocked my path seemed to have disappeared, but now there was something even more disturbing. In the distance I could see shadows moving. They had no definite shape, but they seemed to be watching me. As I walked, the floor of the parking lot began to change. The lines painted on the asphalt disappeared, and the ground looked rougher, more uneven. Then, I heard again the sound that had haunted me since all this began, the beep of the cash register. "Do you think you can get away?" said a familiar voice. It was Allan, or something that seemed to be him. The voice didn't come from a specific place. It seemed to resonate inside my head. "It doesn't matter where you go, David. You already belong to us." I tried to ignore it, keep walking, but the store seemed to be getting closer, even though I was moving away. Each step seemed to take me back to where I had started. And then the shadows started moving. They were closer now, their nondescript forms swaying like smoke, but there was something almost human about their movements. They surrounded me, forming a tight circle around me. I closed my eyes, expecting the worst. But when I opened them, I was back inside Walmart. I was back in the electronics hallway, right where my journey had begun. The shelves were tidy, the lights shone brightly, and the ambient sound of the store was comforting, as if everything had returned to normal. But I knew it wasn't real. I reached for my phone in my pocket to check the time, but the screen showed something strange. Instead of the time, there was a message. "Purchase finalized. Thank you for your visit." It was then that I saw my reflection again, this time on a TV on the shelf next to me. I was smiling, but my eyes, they were not mine. They were black, a complete void, just like Allan's. I realized the truth at that moment. I hadn't escaped. It would never escape. The smile in the reflection of the TV watched me, as if it was challenging me to understand what had happened. My thoughts were confused, scrambled, and the sound of the cash register beep echoed in my mind, even though the store was completely silent. I knew I hadn't left Walmart. Not really. It was as if the place was stuck with me, or maybe I was stuck with it. I looked around, trying to find any sign of exit, but it all seemed too normal, like a scene carefully set up to fool me. Then, I heard footsteps, not mine but several people's, approaching. I quickly turned my head and saw the customers again. They stepped out of the shadows, walking through the halls, their figures indistinct and mechanical movements. But this time, I realized something I hadn't seen before. They were versions of me. Each of them had something of my own. The same way of walking, the same posture, but their faces were disfigured, their eyes completely black. "Do you finally understand?" said a voice behind me. It was Allan. He was standing still with his monotonous expression, but now, his smile seemed even wider, as if he was pleased with my confusion. "You never left here, and it will never leave." You're part of it now. I tried to answer, but my voice didn't come out. It was as if something was suffocating me inside, preventing me from fighting it. The other customers began to approach, slowly, until they were a few steps away from me. Each of them carried something, a bag of snacks, a bottle of water, or even a diary. Things that were mine as if they were holding pieces of me. Allan stepped forward and held out his hand. Don't fight, David. Acceptance. Everyone accepts it eventually. My legs began to sag, and a familiar darkness began to envelop me. Walmart seemed to dissolve, its lights going out one by one, until all that was left was emptiness. And then I realized the truth. I was the next Allan. I woke up, or at least I thought I woke up in the parking lot again. This time, I was wearing the blue Walmart uniform. On my chest, the badge said David. The store was open, silent, and the lights were flashing in the distance, calling me. I knew what would come next. Another unsuspecting customer would soon walk in, lured by the promise of an ordinary supermarket. And then the cycle would start again. And now it's up to you. Which part of this story gave you goosebumps the most? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and share this video with your friends who love spine-tingling stories. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, click the subscribe button so you don't miss the next terrifying reports. Until next time, if you dare to come back,